Rosalie Quinn didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the man threatening to buy every flower she owned. "You can't refuse my employer." "I just did." The assistant stepped closer. Customers stopped breathing. Then another voice interrupted. "That's enough." Every head turned. Cassian Moretti, exceptionally handsome, owner of a multi-billion-dollar empire, leader of one of the world's most feared mafia organizations. His assistant waited for Rosalie to apologize. Instead, she looked directly at Cassian and said, "I won't sell you a single rose until the person you hurt hears an apology from you, not from your money." No one had ever spoken to Cassian Moretti that way. "So why?" Did he smile instead of leaving? Silence settled over the little flower shop. Cassian studied the woman standing behind the counter. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't pretending not to recognize him either. She simply looked disappointed. His assistant, Victor, cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps we should purchase from another florist." Rosalie folded her arms. "I recommend Lily and Thorn on Maple Street. They'll happily sell you 100 roses." Victor stared at her in disbelief. "You are sending business to your competitor?" "I'm sending a man who doesn't want my flowers somewhere they'll be sold." Cassian's lips twitched again. "You know who I am." "I do. And you're still refusing." "I'm refusing the order." She tilted her head. "Not the person." That answer lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Cassian glanced at the untouched payment envelope Victor had prepared. Money usually solved awkward moments. Today, it had become irrelevant. "I asked for roses," Cassian said calmly. "And I asked for honesty." Rosalie shrugged. "We're both leaving disappointed." A nervous laugh escaped one of the customers. Another quickly covered her mouth. Victor looked horrified. Nobody laughed around Cassian Moretti. Nobody. Cassian surprised everyone by chuckling softly. "It appears so." He turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he paused. "What is your name?" "Rosalie." "Rosalie." He nodded once. "I hope your principles remain this expensive." "They're actually free." She smiled politely. "Everyone just assumes they cost money." Cassian left without another word. The tiny bell above the door jingled. Only after the black car disappeared did every customer begin talking at once. "Do you know who that was? You could have made a fortune." "I thought we were about to witness a murder." Rosalie sighed. "I thought I was about to lose my afternoon." Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who visited almost every Tuesday, chuckled. "You certainly have a talent for choosing difficult customers." "I don't choose them." Rosalie picked up a watering can. They bloom naturally. The shop erupted in laughter. The following morning arrived quietly. Rosalie unlocked the shop at 8. She expected an ordinary day. Instead, Cassian Moretti was already waiting outside. Not with bodyguards, not with assistants, just a paper cup of coffee in one hand. She blinked. "We're closed." "I know." He lifted the second cup. "I brought coffee. I don't accept bribes before opening." "It isn't a bribe." "What is it?" "A peace offering." Rosalie looked at the coffee, then at him. "You apologized." "No." "Then we're still negotiating." Another smile appeared. He had smiled more in 24 hours than he had during the previous month. "I suppose we are." She unlocked the door. Cassian made no attempt to enter. "I'll wait." "For what?" "For you to finish opening. You don't have meetings." "I postponed one," she frowned. "For flowers. For curiosity." That answer confused her enough to make her laugh. "I hope your billion-dollar company survives without you for an hour." "So do my executives." She disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, the door opened for customers. Cassian entered with everyone else. He didn't approach the flower display. Instead, he wandered through the shop, studying framed photographs of community weddings, children's art taped beside the register, and handwritten thank you notes pinned to a corkboard. Rosalie finally looked up. "Can I help you?" "Yes." "What are today's carnations called?" She stared. "They're carnations." "I see." He nodded thoughtfully. "And those?" "Daisies." "What about those?" "Sunflowers." Cassian considered each answer with absurd seriousness. Rosalie narrowed her eyes. "You don't actually have flower questions." "I don't?" "No." "What makes you think that?" "Because you've pointed at 3 flowers every kindergarten student recognizes." A teenager buying tulips burst into laughter. Cassian accepted defeat gracefully. "You've caught me." "So," she leaned against the counter, "why are you really here?" Cassian looked around the cheerful little shop, then back at the woman who had refused him without hesitation. "I wanted to understand why someone who clearly needs every customer," his voice softened, "it still refuses to sell something she doesn't believe in." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Finally she answered, "Because if I betray my rules once..." She gently adjusted a bouquet, waiting for pickup. "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what else I'm willing to sell." For the first time in years, Cassian Moretti found himself with no clever reply. He simply nodded and decided he would probably come back tomorrow. The next few days settled into a rhythm that no one in the neighborhood could explain. Every morning, shortly after the flower shop opened, Cassian Moretti appeared. He never arrived with an entourage. He never demanded special treatment. Sometimes he stayed 5 minutes, sometimes 30. And somehow, he still never bought a single flower. The regular customers began timing his visits. Mrs. Henderson whispered that perhaps he was secretly writing a novel. Mr. Alvarez, the retired mailman, insisted Cassian was conducting market research. A pair of college students decided he must be filming an invisible reality show. Rosalie ignored every theory. At least she tried to. One Tuesday morning, an elderly gentleman entered, carrying a faded photograph of his late wife. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it on the counter. "I used to bring her flowers every Friday," he said softly. "Today would have been our 52nd anniversary." Rosalie smiled with quiet warmth. What was her favorite color? Yellow. And what made her laugh? He looked surprised by the question. Why does that matter? Because flowers should remind you of the person, not just decorate the memory. The old man thought for a moment before smiling through damp eyes. She laughed whenever the neighborhood squirrels stole tomatoes from our garden. Rosalie laughed with him. "Then we definitely need something cheerful." She walked slowly through the shop, selecting a handful of sunny yellow daisies instead of the extravagant bouquet displayed near the window. Cassian watched from a respectful distance. "They're not your most expensive flowers," the gentleman observed. "They're not. You'd earn more if you sold me those roses." "I would." She wrapped the daisies carefully. "But I think your wife would have preferred these." The gentleman hesitated. "I'm afraid I only have $20 today." Rosalie quietly removed 2 stems before tying the ribbon. "There. They're smaller. They're balanced." She winked. "And now they're exactly $20. The man blinked. "You changed the bouquet." "I changed the price." He reached for the arrangement with both hands, as though accepting something far more valuable than flowers. "Thank you." "No." Rosalie smiled. "Tell her happy anniversary for me." After he left, Cassian remained unusually quiet. "You could have sold him something twice the price." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" Rosalie adjusted another display without looking at him. "Because grief isn't something you upsell." Cassian had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking. He had watched powerful executives argue over numbers large enough to reshape industries.
Yet somehow, that simple sentence unsettled him more than any boardroom ever had. The following afternoon, the shop became unusually busy. A young mother entered with 2 energetic children, who immediately became fascinated by every colorful bouquet within reach. "I'm sorry," the woman said, trying to stop her youngest from hugging a sunflower. "We're only looking." "Looking is free," Rosalie answered. The little girl pointed toward a bucket of pink carnations. "Mommy likes those." The mother smiled awkwardly. "Maybe another time." Rosalie crouched beside the child. "Is today a special day?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Mommy got her new job." "Oh." Rosalie glanced at the mother's worn handbag and tired expression. "That definitely deserves celebrating." She selected 3 carnations. Not 12, not 20. Just 3. She wrapped them in simple brown paper. "They're perfect." "I can't afford—" "You can." Rosalie named a price so modest that the woman stared in disbelief. "I think you made a mistake." "I don't." The little girl hugged the bouquet before handing it back to her mother. The woman blinked away tears. "You've made our day." Rosalie shook her head. "No. Your daughter already did that." After they left, Cassian finally spoke. "You knew she couldn't pay full price." "Yes." "And you reduced it." "Yes." "You'll never become rich this way." Rosalie laughed. "That depends on how you define rich." She looked around the tiny shop. "I unlock this door every morning excited to come to work." She nodded toward the departing family. "I get to witness moments like that." Then she'd looked back at him. "I sleep well." Cassian followed her gaze toward the street. He owned private jets, luxury hotels, entire office towers, companies in countries Rosalie had never visited. Yet he couldn't remember the last time someone had described success without mentioning money. By the end of the week, Cassian found himself rearranging his schedule without realizing it. Meetings quietly shifted to afternoons. Conference calls became shorter. His mornings somehow developed mysterious gaps. Victor noticed immediately. "You visited that flower shop 6 times. 7. Cassian corrected him absent-mindedly. Victor blinked. "You've been counting?" "No." Cassian paused. "I simply remember." Victor hesitated. "Should I investigate Miss Quinn?" Cassian looked up sharply. "No. But if I wanted information, I already have enough people who collect it." His voice softened. "I'd rather learn who she is from her." Victor had served Cassian for nearly a decade. He had seen negotiations, betrayals, political scandals, and billion-dollar mergers. He had never seen curiosity affect his employer quite like this. Saturday morning brought another surprise. The shop was crowded with weekend customers. Rosalie moved effortlessly between them, remembering birthdays, anniversaries, favorite flowers, even forgotten allergies. Cassian stood patiently near the back, waiting his turn like everyone else. No one dared complain. Eventually, Rosalie reached him. "You've been standing there 15 minutes. "I noticed." "You still don't need flowers." "No." She sighed dramatically. "Then why are you here today?" Cassian looked around the cheerful little shop, watching strangers smile as Rosalie greeted each of them by name. "Finally," he answered honestly. "I wanted to see if you were always like this." "And?" "You are." Rosalie tilted her head. "Was that disappointing?" "No." A quiet smile appeared. "It was educational." She laughed. "I'm not sure that's the nicest compliment I've ever received." "It wasn't intended to be nice." "What was it intended to be?" Cassian met her eyes. "The truth." For reasons she couldn't explain, that answer stayed with Rosalie long after he walked out of the shop. Maybe, she thought as she watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd, the mysterious billionaire wasn't visiting because he wanted to understand flowers. Maybe he was trying to understand something far rarer. Someone who believed kindness could never be a bad investment.
By the beginning of the third week, everyone on the block had stopped asking whether Cassian Moretti would appear. Instead, they wondered what excuse he would invent that day. Rosalie certainly did. On Monday morning, he walked into the shop carrying a leather notebook. "I need flowers." She raised an eyebrow. "That's new. They're for a board meeting." Rosalie blinked. "A board meeting?" "Yes. What exactly are the flowers expected to vote on?" A teenager arranging display buckets burst into laughter. Cassian remained perfectly composed. "They'll improve the atmosphere." Rosalie glanced toward the shelves. "You run a multi-billion-dollar investment company." "I do. And you've concluded the missing ingredient is tulips?" "I'm keeping an open mind." She studied him for a long moment before selecting a modest arrangement of white lilies and blue delphiniums. "No roses?" "I thought those were reserved for apologies." "They are. I don't plan on apologizing during today's meeting." She smiled despite herself. "Then lilies it is." He paid full price without hesitation. As he reached the door, Rosalie called after him. "If your executives suddenly become nicer people, you'll owe the flowers the credit." Cassian looked over his shoulder. "If that happens, I'll place a standing order." The following Wednesday, he returned. "I need another bouquet." Rosalie laughed before he finished speaking. "For what emergency this time?" "A charity luncheon. You attended one last month." "This is a different charity. You've become remarkably generous." "I've always donated." "Then, why didn't you buy flowers before?" Cassian paused. "I hadn't met a florist worth returning to." Rosalie looked away, pretending to inspect ribbons so he wouldn't notice the unexpected warmth creeping into her cheeks. "Careful," she said lightly. "Compliments cost extra." "I'll risk it." She handed him a cheerful arrangement of seasonal blooms. "These, no orchids. They'd make the table stare at itself. And these won't. These encourage conversation." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'll trust your judgment." As he left, Mrs. Henderson leaned over the counter. "I like him." Rosalie sighed. "You like everyone. I tolerated my second husband for 23 years. The elderly woman grinned. "I know the difference." Friday brought another appearance. This time Cassian looked almost uncertain. "I require professional advice." Rosalie folded her arms dramatically. "That sounds expensive." "My assistant's birthday. You don't know what flowers she likes. I know she dislikes unnecessary attention." Rosalie considered that. "So she prefers appreciation over spectacle." "Exactly." She assembled a simple bouquet with soft lavender, eucalyptus, and pale cream roses. "Not too large," she explained. "If someone hates being the center of attention, don't hand them something they can't carry through the office without attracting a crowd." Cassian examined the arrangement. "You think about people before flowers." "I have to." "Why?" "Flowers only matter for a few days." She tied the ribbon carefully. "People remember how you made them feel much longer." Cassian quietly repeated the sentence to himself. "People remember how you made them feel." Somehow, that sounded less like flower advice, and more like life. Word spread quickly through Moretti Capital. Employees noticed flowers appearing in conference rooms, reception desks, break areas, even executive offices. Nobody understood why. One afternoon, Victor cautiously entered Cassian's office. "Yeah." "Yes? We've spent more on flowers this month than during the previous 5 years combined." Cassian continued reviewing documents. "Have we exceeded the budget?" "No." "Have shareholders complained?" No. Has morale improved? Victor hesitated. Actually, yes. People lingered in common areas longer. Teams talked more before meetings. Even the accounting department seemed friendlier. Cassian closed the file in front of him. Interesting. Victor couldn't help asking. Did Miss Quinn tell you flowers increase productivity? No. Then why keep buying them? Cassian looked toward the vase beside his window. A handful of sunflowers caught the afternoon light. They remind people that this building belongs to humans. Victor stared. For several seconds, he genuinely wondered whether someone had secretly replaced his employer. The next morning, Rosalie was rearranging fresh peonies when the bell above the door rang. Without looking up, she smiled. What are they for today? Cassian stopped. You assumed it was me. No one else opens the door that carefully. He laughed. I've developed a recognizable entrance. You've developed recognizable habits. She finally looked at him. So. She leaned on the counter with exaggerated seriousness. Tell me, what floral crisis threatens civilization this morning? Cassian pretended to think. My legal department survived a difficult quarter. They deserve flowers? They deserve encouragement. She nodded slowly. Reasonable. He waited. She continued. I can't believe I just said that. They both laughed. Rosalie shook her head. I'm starting to think your billion-dollar company survives entirely because of flowers. It has survived remarkably well lately. Perhaps I should invoice your shareholders. They might approve it. She pointed a finger at him. You're getting better at this. At business? No. She smiled. At making ridiculous excuses. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It had become comfortable. Customers entering the shop noticed it immediately. There was no flirting, no dramatic romance, just two people who somehow made ordinary conversations unexpectedly enjoyable. Later that afternoon, a delivery driver struggled through the doorway, carrying several heavy boxes of fresh inventory. Before Rosalie could step forward, Cassian had already lifted the largest crate onto his shoulder. You don't have to do that. I know. You're wearing a tailored suit. It will survive. The box weighs almost 50 pounds. So does one of my investment reports. She laughed as he carried the crate into the storage room. When he returned, she handed him a bottle of water. Thank you. My pleasure. You know, she tilted her head. Most wealthy men pay people to carry things. I usually do. So why carry flowers? Cassian looked around the little shop that somehow felt quieter whenever he entered. Because sometimes, he smiled faintly, it's nice to be useful instead of important. Rosalie didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, not at the billionaire, not at the feared mafia leader hidden behind an investment empire, just at the man standing in front of her. For the first time since they had met, she began wondering whether his daily visits had stopped being driven by curiosity, and whether, without either of them noticing, they had quietly become the favorite part of each other's day. By early spring, the neighborhood had accepted one simple fact. If Cassian Moretti's black sedan wasn't parked somewhere on the street, it probably would be before lunchtime. Rosalie pretended not to notice. She noticed every single time. The shop next door belonged to Elias Rowe. At 38, Elias possessed the relaxed confidence of someone who genuinely loved owning a neighborhood bookstore instead of chasing a corporate career. He had an unfortunate habit of arriving exactly when Rosalie needed help. Heavy flower deliveries, broken shelves, jammed delivery carts, a stubborn ladder. If something required lifting, Elias somehow appeared before she could ask. You've got another shipment. He balanced two wooden crates against his shoulder with practiced ease. Rosalie smiled. You have frighteningly good timing. I smelled fresh peonies. You smelled cardboard. I prefer my version. She laughed. I'll allow it. From across the street, Cassian happened to step out of his car. He stopped walking. Elias carried the crates inside without effort. Rosalie thanked him with an easy familiarity that only years of friendship could create. Cassian watched Elias ruffle a strand of hair away from Rosalie's face after a loose leaf had become tangled there. It lasted barely a second. Rosalie didn't even react. Clearly, it wasn't unusual between them. For reasons Cassian couldn't immediately explain, he disliked that observation far more than he expected. Later that afternoon, Cassian entered the flower shop. Rosalie glanced up. "You look thoughtful." "I am. Dangerous." She wrapped a bouquet for another customer. Thinking has consequences. Cassian looked toward the bookstore window next door. The bookseller seems helpful. Elias? Yes. He's wonderful. The word landed harder than Cassian cared to admit. He helps everyone. Everyone? Mrs. Henderson with groceries. The elementary school library. My deliveries. The animal shelter. Rosalie smiled fondly. If kindness paid taxes, he'd go bankrupt. Cassian nodded slowly. I see. You look disappointed. I'm not. You sound disappointed. I merely asked a question. Rosalie studied him, then shrugged. If you say so. Unfortunately for Cassian, the neighborhood had already written its own version of the story. A pair of tourists entered the shop. One whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The bookstore owner and florist make such a cute couple. Rosalie laughed immediately. Oh no, Elias is practically my brother. The tourists looked embarrassed. We're so sorry. No apology necessary. It happens every week. She waved toward the bookstore. He's just been rescuing me from heavy boxes for years. The conversation ended there. For everyone else. Not for Cassian. Practically. The word echoed inside his mind. Practically wasn't exactly the same as actually, which meant someone else might misunderstand. The realization irritated him. Even more irritating. He had absolutely no right to feel irritated. The following morning, Victor found a handwritten note waiting on his desk. Buy 3 books. Beginner gardening, flower arranging, botanical history. Victor stared at it. Then walked into Cassian's office. Sir. Yes? Do you read gardening manuals now? I intend to. You've never kept a plant alive. I'll learn. Victor blinked. Why? Cassian answered, without looking up from his paperwork. I've developed an educational interest. Victor wisely decided not to ask educational in what. That afternoon, Cassian stepped into Elias's bookstore. The bell chimed softly. Elias looked up from organizing a display. Welcome. Looking for anything in particular? Cassian glanced around thousands of books. I believe. He paused. Gardening. Elias smiled. Beginning a new hobby. Something like that. Within minutes, 3 books sat neatly on the counter. One explained flower care. Another covered seasonal planting. The third introduced floral symbolism throughout history. Cassian purchased all 3. As he turned to leave, Elias called after him. Your florist friend will be impressed. Cassian stopped. My florist friend. Elias grinned. You've been buying flowers from Rosalie every week. The whole street knows. Cassian managed a polite smile. I wasn't aware my shopping habits were public knowledge. In this neighborhood? Elias laughed. Everything becomes public knowledge. An hour later, Cassian entered the flower shop, carrying the gardening books. Rosalie looked from the books to him, then back to the books. You bought those? I did. She picked up the beginner's guide. Houseplants for absolute beginners. She tried to remain serious. She failed. You? I thought it seemed practical. Rosalie laughed so hard, she had to lean against the counter. You realize Chapter 1 teaches readers not to overwater cactus plants. I considered that useful information. You've negotiated international mergers. Correct. And now, You're studying watering schedules. Also correct. She shook her head. I cannot decide whether you're joking. I'm trying to learn. Her laughter softened into a smile. You actually are. I am. Rosalie opened the first page. You've bought a good one. You've read it. I recommend it to customers. She looked up. If you have questions. Cassian answered before she finished. I'll ask the expert. For some reason, that simple sentence pleased her more than it should have. Over the following weeks, the comedy only grew. Cassian asked whether tulips enjoyed classical music. Rosalie informed him they preferred silence. He asked if talking to orchids improved blooming. She replied only if the conversation wasn't boring. He proudly announced one of his office plants had produced a new leaf. She congratulated him as though he'd won an Olympic medal. Even the regular customers began participating. Mrs. Henderson routinely asked for updates on Mr. Moretti's botanical education. Children entering the shop wanted to know whether the flower student had completed his homework. Cassian accepted every joke with remarkable patience. Because every laugh from Rosalie felt strangely worth earning. One Friday evening, Elias carried another delivery inside, just as Cassian arrived. The two men met at the doorway. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Elias extended his hand. Elias Rowe, Cassian Moretti. Their handshake was firm, pleasant, completely civil. Rosalie smiled. I'm glad you two finally met. So am I, Elias said easily. Cassian agreed. So am I. Yet, as Elias wished them both a good evening and returned to his bookstore, Cassian found himself watching the man disappear through the neighboring doorway. Rosalie noticed. You know, she began while trimming a rose stem. Most people become jealous because someone is richer. Cassian looked at her. You seem concerned because someone else knows where I keep the spare watering cans. He couldn't help laughing. You've become alarmingly observant. I own a flower shop. She smiled mischievously. I notice when plants lean toward sunlight. Their eyes met. For the first time. Cassian wondered if Rosalie had noticed something else as well. Something he himself was only beginning to understand. That every ridiculous bouquet, every gardening book, every unnecessary excuse, had never really been about flowers. By the time summer arrived, Rosalie's little flower shop had become one of the busiest businesses on the block. Not because of celebrity attention, not because of expensive advertising, but because people trusted her. They knew she would never convince them to spend more than they needed. If a $5 bouquet carried the right meaning, she would never recommend one worth $50. That reputation had taken years to build. It only took one jealous person to try destroying it. Miranda Vale entered the shop wearing a cream designer suit that probably cost more than Rosalie's monthly rent. She was one of the city's most successful luxury wedding planners. Elegant. Perfectly polished. Accustomed to hearing the word yes. She surveyed the modest flower shop with barely disguised disapproval. So, her voice was smooth, this is where he keeps coming. Rosalie looked up from wrapping fresh lavender. I'm sorry. Mr. Moretti. Miranda smiled politely, though there wasn't an ounce of warmth behind it. I've been trying to schedule a consultation with him for months. She glanced around the shop. Apparently, flowers have become more important. Rosalie simply returned to her work. If you're looking for Mr. Moretti, you've come to the wrong business. Oh? I sell flowers. I don't schedule billionaires. Several customers quietly exchanged glances. Miranda stepped closer. You've become rather famous. I wasn't trying to. No? Her smile sharpened. Interesting. She picked up a bouquet. I suppose everyone has their own marketing strategy. Rosalie met her eyes calmly. I've never needed one beyond treating people fairly. Miranda laughed softly. I'm sure that helps. Over the next 2 weeks, Miranda seemed to appear everywhere. At charity events, local markets, neighborhood cafes. Every conversation somehow drifted toward the same implication. "Isn't it fascinating?" she would say with a knowing smile. A tiny flower shop suddenly becomes popular after attracting one very wealthy customer. She never made direct accusations. She didn't need to. People naturally filled in the blanks. Soon whispers began following Rosalie through the neighborhood. Maybe he invested. I heard she gives him free bouquets. Someone told me she opens the shop early just for him. I wonder if that's why business has improved. Rosalie pretended not to hear. But every rumor settled quietly inside her heart. One Saturday afternoon, the tension finally surfaced. The shop was crowded. Mrs. Henderson stood near the register. Young families browsed arrangements for birthdays. A newly engaged couple debated between peonies and roses. Then Miranda walked in. She smiled brightly enough for everyone to notice. "Oh, wonderful. So many customers." Rosalie nodded politely. "Can I help you?" "I certainly hope so." Miranda looked around before speaking, just loudly enough for the entire shop. "I've always admired women who understand how to attract successful men." The room became noticeably quieter. Rosalie didn't answer. Miranda continued. "Some women sell flowers." She paused deliberately. "Others sell attention." Silence. Even the children stopped talking. Mrs. Henderson looked horrified. Rosalie slowly placed the bouquet she had been wrapping onto the counter. Her face remained calm. "I believe you're mistaken." "Am I?" Miranda crossed her arms. "Mr. Moretti visits constantly. You've become the most talked about florist in the city. What an incredible coincidence." Rosalie inhaled slowly. "I don't control who walks through my door." "No," Miranda smiled, "but you certainly benefit from it." Several customers looked uncertain. Not because they believed Miranda completely, but because doubt is easy to plant. Rosalie felt it immediately. Years of quiet honesty suddenly seemed fragile. At that exact moment, the shop bell rang. Cassian Moretti stepped inside. He immediately sensed the unusual silence. His eyes moved from Rosalie's expression to Miranda, then across the uneasy faces filling the shop. What happened? No one answered. Miranda finally spoke. "We were simply discussing business." Cassian looked toward Rosalie. She gave the smallest shake of her head, silently asking him not to create a scene. He understood. So instead of anger, he chose something far more powerful, the truth. Cassian walked to the counter. He removed a neatly folded envelope from inside his jacket. "I believe," he said calmly, "this belongs in today's conversation." Rosalie frowned. "What is it?" "My receipts." Miranda laughed. "Receipts?" Cassian unfolded several documents. "I've kept copies of every purchase I've made here." He placed them on the counter one by one. Every bouquet, every arrangement, every seasonal display, every invoice. Each showed the same thing. Full price paid. No discounts. No complimentary flowers. No special treatment. I have never asked Miss Quinn to lower a price. His voice remained perfectly even. I have never accepted free merchandise. I have never invested in this business. I have never offered to purchase it. He looked around the shop. And she has refused me before. More than one customer smiled, remembering the famous story. Cassian continued. In fact, the very first thing Miss Quinn ever did for me was refuse to sell me flowers. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. The tension began to dissolve. Cassian turned toward Miranda. You suggested she attracts wealthy men for attention. I disagree. He glanced at Rosalie with unmistakable respect. The reason I continue returning is remarkably simple. She is the most honest business owner I have ever met. No drama, no grand declaration. Just quiet certainty. If Miss Quinn believed taking my money violated her principles, he smiled faintly. She would refuse me again today. Rosalie answered immediately. If you tried buying an apology instead of giving one, I absolutely would. Several customers laughed. Cassian nodded. Exactly. Mrs. Henderson clapped first. Others followed. The young engaged couple smiled. I think we'll order our wedding flowers here. Another customer stepped forward. So will I. A father holding his son's hand spoke next. I've watched this shop for years. She's always treated everyone the same. One voice after another joined in. Not because Cassian was powerful, but because his words reminded them of what they had already witnessed themselves. Miranda looked around the room. For the first time, she realized she hadn't damaged Rosalie's reputation. She had revealed her own. The polished confidence disappeared from her face. Without another word, she quietly left the shop. No one stopped her. No one watched her leave. Their attention remained on the woman behind the flower counter. The woman whose integrity had just been defended, not by wealth, but by truth. Cassian looked at Rosalie. You once told me flowers cannot replace honesty. She smiled softly. I remember. I finally understand. For the first time since they had met. Rosalie saw admiration in his eyes that had nothing to do with curiosity. And she realized, somewhere between a refused rose and 100 ordinary conversations, respect had quietly become something much deeper.
The applause faded. The customers returned to browsing. The afternoon slowly regained its ordinary rhythm. Yet something inside Rosalie no longer felt ordinary. For weeks, people had whispered that her success existed because one powerful man kept walking through her door. Cassian had silenced those whispers. Unfortunately, he had also reminded everyone that he still walked through her door every day. Business remained strong, perhaps even stronger than before. New customers arrived after hearing about the confrontation. Many genuinely admired Rosalie's honesty. Others simply wanted to meet the florist who had once refused a billionaire. Rosalie greeted every visitor with the same warmth, but each time someone casually asked, So, is Mr. Moretti coming today? A tiny knot tightened inside her chest. She wanted people to remember her flowers, not her famous customer. A week later, Cassian entered, carrying a modest order form. Before he could speak, Rosalie smiled politely. I think we should take a walk. He immediately noticed the difference. She wasn't teasing. She wasn't laughing. She led him to the small park across the street. Children chased pigeons around the fountain. An elderly couple shared sandwiches on a nearby bench. The afternoon felt peaceful. Rosalie finally broke the silence. I need to ask you something. Anything. She folded her hands together. When people look at my shop, she hesitated. I want them to see years of work. Not your visits? Cassian listened without interrupting. She continued quietly. I know you've never tried to take credit. I know you've never offered me money. I know you've respected every boundary. She smiled sadly. That's exactly why this is difficult. He understood before she finished. You want me to stop coming? Rosalie lowered her eyes. For a while. The words hurt more than she expected. I need to know. She took a slow breath. That if this business succeeds, it succeeds because I earned it. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy. Finally, Cassian nodded. I understand. She looked up. You do? I came here because I admired your principles. A gentle smile crossed his face. I won't ignore them now simply because they inconvenience me. Rosalie laughed softly through the sadness. You always know the right thing to say. No. He shook his head. I simply listened. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Cassian extended his hand. Goodbye. For now. Instead of shaking it, Rosalie hugged him. Briefly, unexpectedly. When she stepped back, both of them pretended not to notice how difficult that goodbye had become. The following Monday, the black sedan never appeared. Tuesday passed, then Wednesday. Customers kept asking, "Is Mr. Moretti traveling?" Rosalie simply smiled. "I imagine he's very busy." She never admitted she found herself glancing toward the window every morning around 9:30, only to remember he wasn't coming. Weeks slipped by. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn. Without realizing it, Rosalie continued noticing little things that reminded her of him. A customer buying lilies for a board meeting. Someone asking beginner gardening questions. A businessman proudly announcing that the office plants were finally surviving. Each memory made her smile, then miss him. Meanwhile, Cassian kept his promise. He never visited. Not once. Victor noticed the change immediately. "You've cancelled your morning walks." "I have." "You haven't purchased flowers in almost a month." Cassian looked toward the empty vase on his office table. "No." Victor hesitated. "Would it really hurt to visit?" Cassian answered after a long pause. "Yes. But not for the reason you think." He picked up the small beginner gardening book Rosalie had once recommended. "If I care about someone," his voice became almost reflective, "then I can't become the reason they doubt what they've built." Victor quietly left the office. For the first time, he understood that whatever existed between Cassian and the florist had long since grown beyond curiosity. One rainy afternoon in late October, Rosalie was closing early. The streets shimmered beneath steady rain. Business had been slow. She locked the register and reached for the light switch. The little bell above the door rang. She looked up automatically. Cassian stood in the doorway. His coat was damp from the rain. There were no flowers, no coffee, no gardening books, no excuses. Only a folded sheet of cream-colored paper held carefully in his hand. Rosalie smiled before she realized she was smiling. "I thought we agreed you were staying away." "I did." "So why are you here?" Cassian lifted the paper. "Because I finally finished something." He handed it to her. She unfolded the page. At the top, written entirely in his own handwriting, were the words, "An apology." Her eyes slowly moved down the page. It was addressed to the business partner from months earlier. The person he had originally intended to send 100 roses to, instead of speaking honestly. There were no legal phrases, no carefully crafted corporate language, no excuses, no explanations. Only accountability, only sincerity. When she finished reading, she looked back at him. "You sent this? This morning. And?" He accepted it. Cassian smiled quietly. "Not because I sent flowers. I didn't. Not because I offered compensation. I didn't. He accepted it. Because I finally said the words myself." Rosalie felt her throat tighten. "You remembered." "I remembered everything." He looked around the familiar flower shop. "The first day we met, you told me flowers don't apologize. People do." He laughed softly. "I spent years believing difficult conversations could be solved with expensive gestures." His eyes met hers. "You were right. Some things cannot be bought. They can only be spoken." Tears gathered in Rosalie's eyes before she could stop them. Not because he had fallen in love with her. He hadn't said that. Not because he had changed for her. He hadn't claimed that either. But because she suddenly understood the truth that had been quietly growing between them all along. He had never returned every day because he wanted roses. He had returned because one ordinary florist had challenged a belief he had carried for years. And little by little, she had changed the way he saw people, the way he led, the way he apologized, perhaps even the way he loved. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, neither of them noticed.
Months passed. Winter gave way to spring once again. The little flower shop on the corner looked much the same as it always had. Fresh flowers greeted customers each morning. Children still pressed their noses against the front window to admire the colorful displays. Mrs. Henderson still arrived every Tuesday, insisting she only wanted to look around before leaving with another bouquet. Some things, Rosalie thought, were wonderfully predictable. Other things had quietly changed forever. Business was thriving, not because anyone famous had invested, not because newspapers had written glowing articles, and certainly not because Cassian Moretti had purchased the shop. He had never offered. She had never asked. Instead, Rosalie's reputation continued growing the old-fashioned way. One satisfied customer recommended another. Neighbors told friends. Brides returned years later to order anniversary bouquets. Children who had once picked flowers with their parents now walked through the same door, carrying flowers for someone they loved. Every success belonged to her. Every long morning, every difficult winter, every decision to place honesty before profit. She had earned all of it, and that knowledge filled her with a quiet kind of pride. Cassian still visited, not every day anymore, sometimes once a week, sometimes every other week. His work remained demanding. Her shop remained busy. Neither expected the other to rearrange an entire life just to prove affection. When he did appear, however, he always purchased exactly one flower, never two, never a bouquet, never another 100 roses, just one carefully chosen stem, sometimes a sunflower, sometimes a white lily, sometimes a simple daisy. Rosalie eventually stopped asking which flower he wanted. She simply handed him the one that seemed right for that particular day. Curiously, she was never wrong. One Thursday afternoon, several executives from Moretti Capital accompanied Cassian to the neighborhood for lunch. Afterward, he excused himself for one quick stop. The executives exchanged amused glances as they followed him into the flower shop. They expected elaborate floral arrangements, perhaps expensive orchids for corporate events. Instead, Cassian approached the counter with the same quiet smile he always wore there. Rosalie looked up from trimming fresh roses. "Good afternoon. It is now," Cassian answered. She laughed. "I was wondering when you'd appear. I've been traveling, so I heard. Mrs. Henderson keeps remarkable track of your schedule." "I don't doubt it." Rosalie walked toward a bucket filled with cheerful yellow ranunculus. Without asking a single question, she selected one perfect bloom. She wrapped the stem in plain brown paper, tied with a narrow green ribbon. Cassian accepted it as though receiving something priceless. One of the executives finally asked the question everyone in the company had been wondering for months. "Sir," Cassian turned, "may I ask something?" "Of course. You used to order dozens of flowers for meetings, celebrations, and company events. We hardly ever place those orders anymore." Cassian looked down at the single flower in his hand, then back toward Rosalie. A warm smile crossed his face, because one flower given honestly, he paused just long enough for everyone to listen, means more than 100 bought to hide the truth. Silence followed. Not confused silence, thoughtful silence. Victor, standing near the doorway, smiled to himself. He remembered the man who had once believed expensive gestures could replace difficult conversations. That man no longer existed. After the executives left, Rosalie leaned against the counter. "You've become rather philosophical. I blame my florist." "Oh? You has a terrible influence." She laughed. "I taught you flowers. You taught me honesty." Rosalie looked away, suddenly unable to hide the color rising in her cheeks. "You give me far too much credit." "No." Cassian stepped a little closer. "I finally give you the right amount." For a moment, neither spoke. The familiar comfort between them needed no conversation. Outside, life continued as usual. Cars rolled past. Children hurried home from school. Someone laughed outside the bookstore as Elias recommended another novel to a customer. The neighborhood carried on, unaware that two ordinary people were standing inside a tiny flower shop at the end of an extraordinary journey. Cassian gently placed the wrapped flower on the counter. "I bought this." "You did. But I don't think it's for me." Rosalie smiled knowingly. "I was hoping you'd figure that out." He picked up the flower again. Then, with the same quiet sincerity that had slowly transformed both of their lives, he held it out toward her. No apology. He smiled. No excuse. No grand gesture. No, just one honest flower. For the woman who reminded me that truth is always more beautiful than appearances. Rosalie accepted it carefully. Not because it was rare. Not because it was expensive. But because every petal carried months of patience, laughter, respect, growth, and quiet devotion. She looked into his eyes. "You know," she said softly, "if you had tried this the first day we met, I still would have refused." Cassian laughed. "I know. And now?" She smiled with the same warmth that had first captured his curiosity. "Now. I'd like to keep the flower." He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had always belonged that way. The customers inside the shop politely pretended not to notice. Mrs. Henderson discreetly wiped away a happy tear. Across the street, Elias glanced through the window, smiled to himself, and quietly turned the sign on his bookstore from "Open" to "Be right back," giving the couple a few uninterrupted minutes they had unknowingly earned. Neither Rosalie nor Cassian ever imagined that refusing to sell a single rose would become the beginning of the greatest love story either of them had ever known. Because sometimes, the smallest flower carries the biggest truth, and the sincerest apology can blossom into a lifetime of love.